It started with a trail of blood on the morning of November 17th, 1957, in a place where nothing ever seemed to happen. Plainfield, Wisconsin was a farming community of fewer than 900 souls, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where doors stayed unlocked, and where the biggest crime in recent memory was petty theft from the county fair. But on that cold November morning, something had gone terribly wrong at Worden's hardware store on Main Street. Bernice Worden, the 58-year-old proprietor, had vanished without a trace. Her son Frank, who worked as a deputy sheriff in the neighboring county, arrived to find the front door unlocked, the register open, and a smear of blood on the floor leading toward the back exit. The store was otherwise orderly, no signs of struggle, no broken glass, just that single streak of crimson pointing toward the alley like an accusation. Frank Worden knew his mother would never leave the store unattended, never leave money in an open till. Something was catastrophically wrong. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Deputy Worden began his investigation the way any good officer would, by reconstructing his mother's last known movements. He examined her appointment book, checked the register tape, spoke with neighbors who might have seen something unusual. What he found was deceptively simple: a sales receipt from the previous day, November 16th, recording a single transaction for a half-gallon of antifreeze. The customer's name was written in his mother's careful handwriting at the top of the slip: Ed Gein. The name meant something to Frank Worden, though not in the way it would soon mean something to the world. Ed Gein was a local handyman, a bachelor in his early 50s who lived alone on a rundown farm about 7 miles outside town. He was known around Plainfield as an odd but harmless figure, someone who took odd jobs, babysat occasionally for neighbors, and could be hired to do minor repairs. People described him as quiet, awkward, even childlike in his demeanor. He had a strange laugh that made some uncomfortable, but he was never threatening, never violent. In a small town where eccentricity was often tolerated as long as it remained peaceful, Ed Gein was simply part of the landscape, another lonely soul scratching out an existence in the rural Midwest. But Frank Worden had heard things over the years, whispers really, nothing solid. Some people said Gein's farm was a mess, filled with junk and garbage. Others mentioned that he seemed overly interested in stories about murder and anatomy, that he would linger too long over newspaper accounts of crimes or ask strange questions about embalming and death. A few women in town had mentioned feeling uncomfortable around him, though they couldn't quite articulate why. He never touched anyone, never said anything overtly inappropriate, but there was something in the way he looked at them, something off. Frank Worden considered these fragments of hearsay, weighed them against the blood on his mother's floor, and made a decision. He would drive out to the Gein farm and ask Ed some questions. It was the logical next step, nothing more. Just a routine follow-up on a receipt. But what Deputy Worden and the officers who accompanied him would discover in the hours that followed would not just shock the conscience of a small Wisconsin town. It would fundamentally alter America's understanding of what a human being could become when isolated, when twisted by psychological forces that no one in 1957 had adequate language to describe. This wasn't just a murder case. It was an archaeological dig into the ruins of a broken mind, and what lay beneath the surface was darker than anyone could have prepared for. To understand what happened in Plainfield in 1957, you have to understand what came before, because Ed Gein wasn't born a monster. He was made into one slowly, methodically, over the course of decades by forces he couldn't control and choices he eventually stopped trying to resist. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, the second son of George and Augusta Gein. His older brother Henry had arrived 3 years earlier. On the surface, the Gein family might have looked unremarkable, just another struggling rural family trying to survive in the early 20th century. But inside that household, something toxic was brewing, a psychological poison that would seep into Ed's developing mind and never leave. George Gein was an alcoholic, a man whose failures in business and in life turned him bitter and violent. He worked sporadically as a carpenter and tanner, but his drinking made steady employment impossible. He was cruel to his sons, both physically and emotionally, and his relationship with his wife was defined by mutual contempt. Augusta despised George, saw him as weak and sinful, a man who had failed his family and failed God. But if George was the absent, destructive force in the household, Augusta was the dominating, suffocating one. Augusta Wilhelmina Gein was a woman of ferocious religious conviction, a Lutheran fundamentalist who believed the world outside her home was drenched in sin and corruption. She read the Bible obsessively, particularly the Old Testament passages about judgment, punishment, and the wickedness of mankind. She believed that women, with the exception of herself, were vessels of lust and depravity, instruments of the devil designed to lead men into damnation. She drilled this belief into her sons from the earliest age they could comprehend language. She told them that their bodies were shameful, that sexual thoughts were evil, that any contact with women outside the family would lead to disease, degradation, and eternal suffering. Augusta saw herself as chosen by God to protect her sons from the corrupting influence of the world, and she pursued this mission with a zealot's intensity. In 1915, when Ed was 9 years old, Augusta moved the family to an isolated 195-acre farm just outside Plainfield. The land was cheap, the farmhouse dilapidated, but it suited Augusta's purposes perfectly. Here, miles from the nearest neighbor, she could control every aspect of her sons' lives. She homeschooled them using the Bible as the primary text, though eventually the state forced her to send them to public school. Even then, she forbade them from making friends, from participating in extracurricular activities, from speaking to girls. Every day after school, they were to come straight home, do their chores, and listen to her read scripture. She told them that the other children were corrupted, that their parents were sinners, that the whole world outside the farm was a cesspool of evil. Ed in particular absorbed these lessons. He was smaller than his brother, more timid, more dependent on his mother's approval. Augusta called him her special boy, and in the twisted logic of that household, being special meant being more closely controlled, more deeply indoctrinated. As Ed grew into adolescence, Augusta's control became even more invasive. She would bathe him well into his teenage years, inspecting his body for signs of what she called impurity. If she found evidence of nocturnal emissions or any indication that he was experiencing normal sexual development, she would punish him, sometimes physically, always psychologically. She told him that his body was betraying him, that the devil was working through his flesh, that he needed to pray harder, to resist the corruption rising within him. Imagine being a young man trapped on an isolated farm, told every day that the natural changes happening in your body are proof of your fundamental sinfulness, that the woman you depend on for survival sees you as teetering on the edge of damnation. Ed learned to suppress everything, to bury every impulse, every curiosity, every flicker of independence. He learned that to be loved by his mother, he had to become a ghost, a hollow vessel filled only with her words, her beliefs, her will. George Gein died in 1940 from heart failure, brought on by years of alcoholism. Augusta showed little emotion at his passing. She had long since written him off as a lost soul, beyond redemption. For Ed and Henry, their father's death meant one less source of chaos in the household, but it also meant that Augusta's grip tightened further. Without George, even as a negative presence, the boys had no counterbalance to their mother's extremism. Henry, the older brother, had begun to show signs of resistance. He questioned Augusta's teachings, talked about wanting to leave the farm, suggested that their mother's worldview might not be entirely accurate. Some accounts suggest that Henry even spoke to neighbors about how controlling Augusta was, how trapped he felt. Ed, however, remained loyal. He defended his mother, insisted that she was right about everything, that the world really was as wicked as she described. Then in 1944, Henry died. The circumstances were suspicious from the beginning. On May 16th, the brothers were burning brush on a marshy section of the property, a common practice for clearing land. According to Ed's initial account, the fire got out of control, and in the confusion and smoke he lost track of Henry. He claimed he searched, but couldn't find his brother, so he returned home and alerted the authorities. A search party was organized, and Ed led them directly to Henry's body, lying face up in an area that hadn't been touched by the fire. Henry's body showed signs of blunt force trauma, bruises on his head that suggested he'd been struck. The fire hadn't reached him, and yet he was dead. The local coroner, perhaps unwilling to believe that quiet, awkward Ed could have harmed his own brother, ruled the death asphyxiation from smoke inhalation, even though the evidence didn't support that conclusion. No autopsy was performed. No investigation was launched. Henry Gein was buried, and the matter was closed. But the people who knew the family wondered. Some suspected that Ed had killed Henry, whether in a moment of rage or in a calculated act to eliminate the one person who threatened his bond with Augusta. Others thought perhaps Henry had confronted Ed about their mother, and something had snapped. The truth died with Henry, or perhaps it remained locked inside Ed, a secret he carried alongside all the others. A year later, Augusta suffered a stroke. She survived, but she was weakened, partially paralyzed. For Ed, this was both a crisis and an opportunity. His mother, the woman who had defined every moment of his existence, was now helpless, dependent on him. He cared for her obsessively, attending to her every need, reading the Bible to her, praying with her, trying desperately to keep her alive. But on December 29, 1945, Augusta suffered a second stroke. This one killed her. Ed Gein, at 39 years old, was utterly alone for the first time in his life. He had no friends, no social connections beyond the most superficial interactions in town. He had never been with a woman, never held a job for long, never developed any identity separate from his role as Augusta's son. When she died, a part of him died with her, the part that had been holding him together, however tenuously. What remained was something hollow, something broken, something that would soon begin searching for a way to fill the void she left behind. After Augusta's death, Ed did something that would later be recognized as profoundly significant. He sealed off her bedroom, her living room, and the upstairs of the farmhouse, leaving everything exactly as it had been when she was alive. Her clothes remained in the closet, her Bible on the nightstand open to the book of Revelation, her furniture untouched. He preserved these spaces like a shrine, a museum dedicated to her memory. But the rest of the house, the parts he inhabited, he let decay. Garbage piled up, newspapers accumulated in stacks, dishes went unwashed, and the structure itself began to rot. The contrast was striking. Half of the house frozen in time, maintained with obsessive care, the other half sliding into squalor and filth. It was as if Ed himself was splitting in two, part of him desperately clinging to the past, to his mother's presence, and part of him descending into chaos and disintegration. In the years following Augusta's death, Ed took odd jobs around Plainfield. He worked as a handyman, babysat for neighbors, did farm labor when he could find it. The money he earned was meager, but his needs were minimal. He grew vegetables, hunted small game, and largely withdrew from society. People in town noticed that he was becoming stranger, more reclusive. But in rural Wisconsin in the 1940s and 50s, eccentricity was often tolerated. As long as Ed wasn't bothering anyone, as long as he paid what few bills he had, people left him alone. But what people didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that during this time Ed was developing an obsession that would eventually manifest in ways no one could have imagined. He began reading extensively, purchasing books and magazines from shops in nearby towns. He bought anatomy textbooks, accounts of Nazi medical experiments, pulp magazines about cannibals, and headhunters, anything that dealt with death, the human body, and the boundaries of what could be done to flesh. He studied embalming techniques, learned about taxidermy, absorbed information about how to preserve organic material. Why he was drawn to these subjects is a question that has occupied psychologists for decades. Some believe he was trying to understand death, to demystify it, to gain some control over the force that had taken his mother from him. Others think he was simply following a compulsion, a dark curiosity that had always been there, suppressed by Augusta's control, now free to express itself. But Ed's interest wasn't purely theoretical. At some point in the late 1940s, he began visiting the local cemeteries at night. Plainfield had several small burial grounds, and Ed knew them well. He read the obituaries in the local paper, paying particular attention to the deaths of middle-aged and older women, especially those who had been buried recently. Then, armed with a shovel and sometimes accompanied by a local man named Gus, though this companionship is disputed, Ed would go to the cemetery after dark, locate a fresh grave, and dig. He would exhume the body, open the casket, and take what he wanted. Sometimes he took the entire corpse, loading it into his truck and driving it back to the farm. Other times he took only parts, severing heads, removing skin, extracting organs. He worked quickly, efficiently, as if he'd practiced the motions in his mind many times before attempting them in reality. What Ed did with the bodies he brought back to the farm is where the story crosses from the merely macabre into the realm of the incomprehensible. He didn't simply collect corpses. He processed them, using techniques he'd learned from his reading and perhaps from his father's old tanning equipment. He skinned the bodies, treated the skin with chemicals to preserve it, and fashioned it into objects. He made masks from the faces of women, stretching and tanning the skin so it could be worn like a second face. He created a vest from the torso skin of a female corpse, complete with breasts attached, a garment he could wear to simulate a woman's body. He upholstered furniture with human skin, crafted lampshades from facial skin, made bowls from skulls, and fashioned a belt from human nipples strung together like grotesque beads. He preserved vulvas in jars, painted one silver, and mounted it as if it were a trophy. He kept a box containing female genitalia, lips, noses, and other body parts, all meticulously preserved. These weren't random acts of mutilation. They were purposeful, methodical, the work of someone following an internal logic that, however twisted, was consistent. Ed later admitted, during his interrogations, that he would sometimes dress in these macabre creations at night. He would put on the skin vest, drape one of his mother's dresses over it, place a preserved face mask over his own, and walk through the darkened farmhouse by lantern light. He said he felt like he was becoming his mother, that by wearing the skin and clothing of women who resembled her, he could bring her back or at least feel close to her again. Psychologists would later describe this as a form of necrophilic transsexualism, a condition so rare that Ed Gein remains one of the only documented cases. He wasn't sexually attracted to the corpses, or at least he claimed not to be. His motivation was something stranger, a desire not to possess the dead but to become them, to merge his identity with theirs, and through them with his mother. It was an attempt at resurrection, a grotesque and doomed effort to reverse death itself by wearing its remnants like a costume. For approximately 12 years, from the late 1940s through 1957, Ed Gein lived this double existence. By day, he was the odd but harmless handyman, the man who would shovel your driveway or fix your fence. By night, he was something else entirely, a figure moving through cemeteries and shadows, building a secret world out of skin and bone. No one suspected. No one knew. The farmhouse, set back from the road and surrounded by trees, kept its secrets, and Ed, for all his strangeness, never gave anyone reason to look too closely. He was careful, methodical, patient. He understood that what he was doing had to remain hidden, not because he fully grasped the moral or legal implications, but because he knew instinctively that the world would not understand. And so he waited, and he worked, and he built his collection piece by piece, body by body, until the day he made a decision that would finally expose everything. On December 8, 1954, Mary Hogan, a 51-year-old woman who operated a tavern in the nearby town of Pine Grove, vanished. It was a Saturday evening, and the tavern was usually busy. But when a customer arrived around 7:30, he found the place empty, the lights on, the door unlocked, and a pool of blood on the floor. There was a spent .32 caliber shell casing near the blood, suggesting a shooting, but Mary Hogan was nowhere to be found. Authorities launched an investigation, interviewed regulars, searched the surrounding area, but they found nothing. No body, no witnesses, no clear motive. Mary was a businesswoman, well-liked, with no known enemies. The case went cold within weeks, filed away as an unsolved disappearance, possibly a murder, but without evidence or leads, there was little the police could do. 3 years later, her fate would be revealed in the most horrific way imaginable. By November 1957, Ed Gein's secret life had been ongoing for nearly a decade. He had robbed dozens of graves, possibly more, though the exact number would never be determined because he sometimes claimed not to remember the details, insisting he acted in a fugue state, a kind of dissociative trance. Whether this was true or a convenient excuse is debatable. What is certain is that at some point, grave robbing was no longer sufficient. Perhaps the bodies he found were too decomposed, perhaps the thrill had faded, or perhaps something inside him demanded a fresh victim, someone who hadn't yet been touched by decay. On the morning of November 16, 1957, Ed Gain walked into Warden's hardware store in Plainfield. He had been there before, knew the owner Bernice Warden, and had even mentioned to her son Frank that he might stop by to buy antifreeze for his truck. When he entered the store, it was empty except for Bernice. They exchanged pleasantries, and Ed asked about a rifle on the wall, a .22 caliber model. Bernice turned to check the price, or perhaps to retrieve the rifle from its mount. And in that moment, Ed raised his own .22, aimed at the back of her head, and fired. The shot was quick, clean, and almost certainly fatal. Bernice Warden collapsed to the floor, dead or dying, and Ed set to work. He locked the front door, pulled his truck around to the back of the store and loaded Bernice's body into the bed. He covered her with a tarp, drove out of town, and headed back to his farm. Once there, he brought the body into his shed, the same outbuilding where he had processed the corpses from the cemetery. He worked with practiced efficiency, hanging Bernice by her ankles from the rafters using a wooden crossbar and ropes. He decapitated her, gutted her from crotch to chest, removing her internal organs and drained the blood. The process was nearly identical to how hunters dress a deer, and Ed had done this many times before, both with animals and with human remains. By the time he was finished, Bernice Warden's body had been reduced to a carcass, stripped of identity, of humanity, transformed into raw material. Ed left the body hanging in the shed, went into his house, and presumably went about his business as if nothing unusual had happened. But Ed had made a mistake. A small one, but in a town like Plainfield, small mistakes are all it takes. He had been seen near the hardware store on the morning of Bernice's disappearance. More importantly, he had left a receipt, the sales slip for the antifreeze, with his name written on it in Bernice's own handwriting. When Frank Warden discovered his mother missing and found that receipt, the path to Ed Gein was clear and direct. On the evening of November 16th, a Saturday, investigators began asking around town about Ed's whereabouts. They learned he had planned to visit his mother's grave and then go to a nearby farm to help a neighbor. Deputies drove to the neighboring farm and found Ed there, working as if it were any other day. They asked him to come in for questioning, told him there had been an incident, and Ed, without hesitation or apparent concern, agreed. He seemed almost eager to cooperate, a reaction that would later strike investigators as deeply unsettling. They didn't arrest him immediately, didn't accuse him of anything. They simply wanted to talk. But while Ed was being interviewed at the sheriff's office in Wautoma, another team of officers was driving out to his farm to conduct a search. It was dark when they arrived, the farmhouse silhouetted against the November sky, no lights visible inside. The officers approached cautiously, unsure what they would find but aware that something was wrong. Deputy Sheriff Dan Chase and Sheriff Art Schley entered through the back door, pushing it open to reveal a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The smell hit them first, a thick, putrid odor of decay, rot, and something chemical, like formaldehyde mixed with death. They switched on their flashlights and began to move through the house. The kitchen was a disaster. Piles of garbage, dirty dishes, newspapers, and trash stacked in every corner. The living areas were nearly impassable, filled with junk and debris. But it was when they reached the shed that they found what they were looking for, and it was worse than any of them could have imagined. Hanging from the rafters, suspended by her ankles, was the decapitated, gutted body of Bernice Warden. She had been split open from crotch to chest, her organs removed, her body washed clean. The sight was so grotesque, so utterly inhuman, that one of the officers vomited on the spot. Another had to step outside to compose himself. But the horror didn't end there. As the officers began a more thorough search of the property, they started finding things, objects that didn't make sense, that shouldn't exist. In the kitchen, they found bowls made from human skulls, the tops sawed off and the interiors cleaned out. In a box, they found a collection of vulvas preserved in some kind of solution. They found a belt made from human nipples, a lampshade crafted from the skin of a human face, a vest constructed from the torso of a woman, complete with breasts. They found chairs upholstered with human skin, a shoebox containing 9 vulvas painted silver, a hanging human head, and multiple masks made from the faces of women, peeled off and tanned like leather. In a paper bag, they found another face, this one belonging to Mary Hogan, the tavern owner who had disappeared 3 years earlier. Near it was her skull, also preserved. The farmhouse wasn't just the scene of a murder. It was a gallery, a workshop, a museum of death constructed over the course of years. Every room held new horrors, new impossibilities. The officers documented everything, photographed what they could stomach photographing, and tried to process what they were seeing. Some of the younger deputies broke down in tears. Veteran officers, men who had seen accidents and suicides and violence, found themselves unable to function, unable to reconcile the quiet man they knew as Ed Gain with the evidence surrounding them. While the search was ongoing, Ed was still at the sheriff's office, sitting calmly in an interrogation room. When confronted with the discovery of Bernice Warden's body, he confessed almost immediately. He described shooting her in the hardware store, loading her into the truck, taking her back to the farm and butchering her in the shed. He spoke without emotion, recounting the details as if he were describing how to change a tire. When asked about Mary Hogan, he paused, then said, "I guess you want to know about her too." He admitted to shooting her as well 3 years earlier, transporting her body to the farm, and preserving parts of her just as he had done with Bernice. But when investigators asked about the other remains, the masks, the furniture, the grotesque collection, Ed's answers became more complicated. He claimed that most of the body parts came from graves, not from living victims. He said he had been robbing cemeteries for years, that he would dig up recently buried women and bring them back to the farm. He insisted he had only killed 2 people, Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden. Everything else, he said, came from the dead. Investigators faced a dilemma. They had physical evidence of at least 2 murders, but they also had the remains of possibly a dozen or more individuals scattered throughout the property. Were these all from graves, as Ed claimed, or were there more victims, people who had disappeared without anyone noticing? The task of identifying the remains was daunting. Many of the body parts were so altered, so processed, that matching them to specific individuals was nearly impossible with the forensic technology available in 1957. Dental records could help with skulls, but most of the remains had been modified beyond recognition. Authorities began exhuming graves in local cemeteries, checking to see if the caskets had been disturbed. They found evidence that several graves had indeed been opened, the coffins violated, the bodies missing or partially missing. It appeared that Ed was telling the truth, at least about the grave robbing, but the question of whether there were additional murder victims beyond Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden remained unanswered, and to this day it remains a matter of speculation. Ed Gain was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Bernice Warden. The evidence was overwhelming, his confession was clear, and there was no question of his guilt in the legal sense. But almost immediately, questions arose about his mental state. Was he sane enough to stand trial? Did he understand the nature of his actions? The court ordered a psychiatric evaluation, and Ed was sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. Over the following months, psychiatrists examined him, conducted interviews, administered tests, and tried to understand what had driven him to commit such acts. Their conclusions were complex. Ed was not psychotic in the traditional sense. He did not hear voices, did not suffer from delusions that prevented him from understanding reality. He knew that what he had done was illegal, knew that society condemned it. But his motivations, his psychological drives, were so far outside the norm that the doctors struggled to classify him. He exhibited signs of severe schizophrenia, but also elements of necrophilia, fetishism, and a profound attachment disorder stemming from his relationship with his mother. In January 1958, Judge Herbert Bunde ruled that Ed Gein was mentally incompetent to stand trial. He was committed indefinitely to Central State Hospital, where he would remain for the next decade. The discovery at the Gein farm sent shockwaves far beyond Plainfield. News of the case spread rapidly, first through Wisconsin, then across the nation, and eventually around the world. The details were so grotesque, so unprecedented, that many newspapers hesitated to print the full story, fearing it was too disturbing for the public. But the story leaked out in pieces, in whispers, in rumors, and eventually the full scope of Ed's crimes became public knowledge. People were horrified, fascinated, and deeply unsettled. This wasn't a crime of passion, a robbery gone wrong, or even a serial killing in the way the term would later be understood. This was something else, something that suggested the existence of psychological depths that no one had fully acknowledged before. The concept of a serial killer was not yet part of the American cultural lexicon in 1957. There had been multiple murderers before, certainly, but the idea of someone who killed repeatedly, methodically for psychological gratification, was not widely recognized. Ed Gein's case, along with others that would emerge in the following decades, would help create that framework, that understanding that some individuals could commit acts of violence that were not crimes of necessity or emotion, but expressions of deep psychological disturbance. In Plainfield itself, the reaction was one of shock and disbelief. People who had known Ed, who had hired him to babysit their children, who had chatted with him at the hardware store, struggled to reconcile the quiet, awkward man they knew with the monster whose crimes were now public. Some felt guilt, wondering if they should have noticed something, if there were signs they missed. Others felt anger, betrayed by the fact that such evil had existed in their midst, hidden behind a facade of normalcy. The farmhouse itself became a source of morbid fascination. In March 1958, just a few months after Ed's arrest, the property was scheduled to be auctioned off to help cover legal expenses. Thousands of people showed up, drawn by curiosity, by a desire to see the place where such horrors had occurred. But the auction never happened. On the morning of the scheduled sale, the farmhouse mysteriously burned to the ground. Arson was suspected, and most people believed that locals had set the fire, driven by a desire to erase the physical reminder of what had happened. No arrests were ever made, and no one came forward to claim responsibility. The barn and outbuildings remained standing for a time, but they too were eventually demolished. Today, nothing marks the spot where Ed Gein's farmhouse once stood. The land has been reclaimed by forest and field, as if nature itself wanted to cover the scar. Ed Gein spent 10 years at Central State Hospital, where he was treated for his mental illness and observed by some of the leading psychiatric minds of the era. In 1968, doctors determined that he had improved sufficiently to stand trial. He was returned to court, and in November of that year he was tried for the murder of Bernice Worden. The trial was brief. Ed's attorneys did not contest the facts of the case. Instead, they argued that Ed was mentally ill at the time of the murder, that he could not be held fully responsible for his actions. The jury agreed. Ed Gein was found guilty of first-degree murder, but was also deemed to be legally insane. He was sentenced to life in a psychiatric institution, a sentence that meant he would never be released. He was transferred to Mendota State Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin, where he would spend the remainder of his life. At Mendota, Ed became a model patient. He was polite, cooperative, and caused no trouble. He read the Bible, played cards and checkers with other patients, and participated in art therapy sessions. Staff members described him as pleasant, even likable, a far cry from the figure of horror he represented to the outside world. But in conversations with psychiatrists, Ed revealed the depth of his attachment to his mother, an attachment that had not diminished despite decades of separation. He spoke about Augusta as if she were still alive, as if she were still the central figure in his life. He expressed no remorse for his victims, showed no understanding of the pain he had caused their families. When asked why he had done what he did, he struggled to articulate an answer, often falling back on vague statements about not remembering or feeling compelled by forces he didn't understand. Ed Gein died on July 26, 1984, from respiratory failure due to cancer and heart disease. He was 77 years old. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery in an unmarked grave next to his mother. Even in death, he could not escape the notoriety of his crimes. His grave became a target for vandals and curiosity seekers, people who wanted a piece of the infamy, a connection to the horror. His headstone was stolen multiple times, chipped away piece by souvenir hunters, until the cemetery officials gave up trying to replace it. Today, his grave is unmarked, just a patch of grass among the other graves, indistinguishable except to those who know where to look. Augusta's grave, by contrast, still bears a headstone, a final marker of the woman whose influence shaped not only Ed's life, but also the lives he destroyed. The legal and forensic aftermath of the Gein case extended far beyond Ed's own trial. The discovery of so many human remains on his property forced authorities to conduct extensive investigations into missing persons cases across the region. They exhumed graves, interviewed families, and tried to determine whether there were additional murder victims beyond Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden. The consensus that emerged was that Ed had told the truth, that most of the remains came from graves, not from living victims. But the possibility that there were others, people whose disappearances went unreported or uninvestigated, has never been entirely ruled out. Rural Wisconsin in the 1940s and 50s was a place where people could disappear without much fanfare, especially women living alone, transients, or individuals on the margins of society. Some researchers and investigators have speculated that Ed may have been responsible for additional deaths, but without concrete evidence, these remain theories, shadows of doubt that linger over the case. From a forensic and psychological standpoint, the Gein case was groundbreaking. It represented one of the first times that law enforcement, psychiatrists, and the public were forced to confront the reality of a killer whose motivations were not financial, not passionate, but deeply psychological. Ed Gein's crimes were driven by a need to inhabit his mother's identity, to resurrect her through the grotesque manipulation of human remains. This was not about sexual sadism, though there were sexual elements. It was about identity, about the collapse of the self, and the desperate attempt to rebuild it using the bodies of the dead. The case would become a cornerstone in the study of criminal psychology, cited in textbooks, analyzed in academic papers, and used as a teaching example for generations of psychologists, criminologists, and law enforcement professionals. It helped establish the field of psychological profiling, the idea that understanding a killer's motivations and mental state could aid in predicting behavior and solving crimes. But perhaps even more significantly, Ed Gein's case had a profound impact on American popular culture, an impact that continues to reverberate to this day. Within a few years of his arrest, elements of his crimes began appearing in fiction, in films, in books that sought to explore the darkest corners of the human psyche. In 1959, the writer Robert Bloch published a novel titled Psycho, inspired in part by the Gein case. The novel told the story of Norman Bates, a quiet motel owner dominated by his mother, who keeps her corpse preserved in the house and occasionally dresses in her clothing. The parallels to Ed Gein were unmistakable. A year later, Alfred Hitchcock adapted Bloch's novel into a film, one of the most iconic horror movies ever made, and Norman Bates became a cultural archetype, the mama's boy whose psychological damage manifests in murder. The character was fictional, but the inspiration was real, rooted in the crimes of a Wisconsin farmer whose name most moviegoers would never know. In 1974, the film The Texas Chainsaw Massacre introduced the character of Leatherface, a killer who wore a mask made of human skin and wielded a chainsaw. The filmmakers openly acknowledged that the character was inspired by Ed Gein, particularly the skin masks and the rural, isolated setting. Leatherface became one of the most enduring figures in horror cinema, a symbol of primal, irrational violence. And in 1991, the film The Silence of the Lambs featured the character of James Gumb, also known as Buffalo Bill, a killer who murdered women and used their skin to create a suit driven by a desire to transform himself. The character's motivations, his methods, and his psychological profile all drew heavily from the Gein case. These fictional killers, Norman Bates, Leatherface, Buffalo Bill, have become ingrained in popular culture, but they are all echoes, distorted reflections of a real man who lived, who killed, and who built a house of horrors out of flesh and bone. The question that haunts the Gein case, the question that psychiatrists, writers, and the public have grappled with for decades, is how could this happen? How could a man live for years in the middle of a small town, committing acts of unimaginable grotesqueness, and no one noticed? The answer is complex, rooted in the social realities of mid-century rural America. Plainfield was a community where privacy was respected, where people minded their own business, where eccentricity was tolerated as long as it didn't cause harm. Ed Gein was odd, yes, But he was also non-threatening, polite and useful. He fixed things, helped neighbors, and never gave anyone reason to fear him. The idea that he might be capable of murder, let alone the desecration of corpses and the creation of objects from human remains, was so far outside the realm of possibility that it simply didn't register. People saw what they expected to see: a lonely, awkward man living a quiet life on a rundown farm. They didn't see the darkness beneath because they had no framework for recognizing it, no language for understanding it. Moreover, the era itself played a role. The 1950s were a time of conformity, of surface-level normalcy, of a collective desire to believe that evil was distant, foreign, something that happened elsewhere. The horrors of World War II were still fresh in memory, but those horrors had occurred overseas, perpetrated by enemies. The idea that such evil could exist in a quiet Wisconsin town, in the farmhouse of a man who babysat for his neighbors, was incomprehensible. Ed Gein shattered that illusion, forced people to confront the possibility that monsters didn't always look like monsters, that they could be quiet, polite, and familiar. This realization, this loss of innocence, is part of Ed Gein's legacy, a cultural shift that made it impossible to ever again assume that surface appearances told the whole story. Ed Gein did not invent the serial killer, but he helped define what that term would come to mean. He was not driven by rage, by lust for power, or by sadism in the conventional sense. He was driven by a need to repair a broken psyche, to fill a void left by his mother's death, to become something other than what he was. His crimes were an attempt at transformation, grotesque and doomed but coherent within his own twisted logic. And in that sense, he was different from many of the killers who would follow him, killers who killed for control, for pleasure, for the thrill of domination. Ed Gein killed because he was trying to resurrect the dead, to bring back the one person who had defined his existence. And when that proved impossible, he tried to become her instead. This psychological complexity, this tragic and horrifying motivation, is what makes the Gein case so enduringly fascinating and so deeply disturbing. The real horror of Ed Gein is not the blood, not the body parts, not the masks or the furniture, or the grotesque inventory of human remains. The real horror is the idea that someone could live a double life so completely, could maintain a facade of normalcy while secretly constructing a world of death. It's the realization that the person who smiles at you in the grocery store, who helps you carry your groceries, who seems harmless and kind, might be hiding something unimaginable. Ed Gein reminds us that we can never fully know another person, that the human mind is capable of compartmentalization and deception on a scale that defies understanding. And that, more than any single act of violence, is what keeps people awake at night, what makes true crime documentaries compelling, what makes the case of Ed Gein a permanent scar on the American consciousness. Because if it could happen in Plainfield, Wisconsin, if it could happen there, then it could happen anywhere. And that is the legacy of Ed Gein, not just a story of murder and madness, but a reminder that evil doesn't announce itself, doesn't wear a sign, doesn't always reveal itself until it's too late. Ed Gein was a quiet man who lived alone on a farm, and for 12 years, no one knew what he was doing in the dark. That silence, that invisibility, is the most terrifying thing of all.